and that's what the New York Times Magazine and others have said recently. That's pretty serious. And for the first time, we actually have a number of scientists speculating that there's a possibility of species extinction in terms of human beings within the coming century. The New York Times Magazine, which dedicated their entire edition about a month ago to the issue that the planet is doomed because we had a period of time 30 years ago we knew about climate change and failed to act. Now there's so much partisan bickering that Congress, state legislature refused to act, and it basically we will quickly move to above 5 degrees Celsius worldwide warming, and that's where you get to the existential threat. In fact, Jerry Brown, as governor, put his quote in a study that the University of California, San Diego released recently, saying that there was a 30 to 40% chance of species extinction within the next 50 years. When I say species extinctions, I mean human beings. That worries me. And, actually in the Democratic National Platform, they have called for an emergency mobilization to deal with climate change. Their policies are not doing that. The governor keeps on putting out press releases that he's increased, solar by 1,000% since he's been governor. Yet at the same time, the reality is you have a grand total of 1.07% of the state's electricity coming from solar, and a grand total of 4% coming from wind and solar. It's not adequate. And you actually go look at the DEC. A couple of years ago, legislation was passed to require the Department of Environmental Conservation to make an estimate on an ongoing basis as to how bad climate change will be. And they actually say by 2080, at the upper end, that temperatures will rise 10 degrees Fahrenheit in New York State. That's the 5 degrees centigrade that people point to as an existential threat, and that is the official policy of New York State, that we may hit that mark within 60 years. I find it depressing that there's even an issue that we need to convince the state controller to divest from fossil fuels. When I helped with 350.org start this campaign 5 years ago, we started it partly as a way to get people to organize locally, but because it was morally wrong, in our opinion, for the New York State to be seeking to benefit from the destruction of the planet, destruction of life on the planet. But, and since we started the campaign 5 years ago, we've managed to divest $6.2 trillion, that's with a T, not a B, about 1,000 institutions worldwide. Ireland recently became the first nation to divest. New York City voted earlier this year to begin the process of divesting the two largest pension plans from fossil fuels. But as we have moved forward, we also realize that continuing to invest in fossil fuels is a bad financial risk for New York State. Tom Sanzillo, who is the acting state controller between Hevesy and DiNapoli, has put out a number of reports showing that the fossil fuel sector is now underperforming everything else in the stock market at this point. There have been studies that have been done showing that if the state had divested at the point we asked them to initially divest 5 years ago, the state would have somewhere over an extra $10 billion in the pension fund. So it's a bad financial decision not to divest. It's also a bad moral decision to continue to invest in companies that are destroying and threatening the future of life on humanity. Howie's sort of articulated the other issues we're concerned about: 100% by 2030, going to a state carbon tax. And certainly here in the Capital District, the idea that we're moving off from fossil fuels, but the state's going to invest $88 million to build 2 new frac gas turbines on Sheridan Avenue in order to power the Empire State Plaza, rather than investing in things like geothermal for heating and solar and wind for electricity is quite upsetting. Obviously, you want the controller to do more about the issue of corruption. As people may know, right before the governor put out the contracts for Buffalo Billion, which his administration officially convicted of rigging the bids. It was sort of ironic that the company who bids were rigged in favor of said to the state, you can't be so obvious about the bid rigging. You need to reduce the number of unique points in the RFP that apply to us. When you put 20-plus points into the bid, that's so obvious it's going to raise a lot of question. Right before he awarded that contract, he got the state legislature to remove the oversight of the state controller to those type of contracts. This year, a complicated story, but the New York State Senate, at the last moment, decided to punish the governor over his role in getting the IDC to rejoin the mainstream Democrats. And so they passed two bills, one to restore the oversight of these contracts to the state controller. The other was to create more data with respect to what I find is a real abuse, the economic development program. Even though it was the Assembly bill, the Assembly bowed to the governor and refused to pass the two bills at the end of session. And I did not hear Tom DiNapoli yelling to his former colleagues in the State Assembly, who, remember, initially appointed him to be state controller and was not elected initially, that what they were doing was wrong. I think we need a green to watch the green. You know, if you're going to try to stamp out corruption, you need to have people who are outside the present two-party system that is engaged, in our opinion, in organized criminal activities at the state legislature with, I believe, 40 state legislators, other state top officials being forced to resign over the last 15 to 20.
I did a recount, 50 since 2000, over 50.
Over 50 since 2000. We all know that corruptions exist. It permeates our state government. Cuomo is the linchpin of that organized criminal activity. If we want corruption ended, we have to vote them out of office. At this point, we'll be glad to answer any questions you might have for us.
I have a question. You talked about free education, and my big thing is the $1.5 trillion debt that's carried by, people with student loan problems. I know Jill addressed it. Will you address it in the gubernatorial race?
Yeah, we can't deal with the whole 1.5 trillion nationally. That requires a national policy.
Correct.
But in the state, James Skoufis, an assembly person, had a bill for tuition-free college before Cuomo did his Excelsior scholarship. And I heard price tags between $1.5 and $2 billion. And I think with the top 1% in the state now getting over 30% of all income in the state, up from 12% in 1980, that was $375 billion for just 90,000 taxpayers, each getting an average income of $4.5 million. They can pay more. They can pay 10% more of their income through a stock transfer tax, a more progressive income tax with brackets in the multi-million-dollar income level, and generate, those two taxes alone would generate about $25 billion. We're going to do a news conference later about the numbers involved, but the point is we can't afford to do that so that students can go to public colleges without going into debt. And I think that's the contribution we can make at the state level. The Excelsior Scholarship, there have been studies out, 3% of the SUNY students and 2% of the CUNY students can qualify, and then it still doesn't cover living expenses because it's a last dollar program. You got to spend your Pell Grant and any other thing you get before you get the Excelsior, and then you got to graduate so fast that if you're from the working poor and you got to work to support yourself while you're going to school, you just can't afford the Excelsior Scholarship. So we need a true tuition-free college program like CUNY had from 1848 till 1976.
My contention is, over the past 30, 40 years, Sally Mae, the banks, they're corrupt. They're even more corrupt than the government, and they've bled people dry. That has to be looked at. That has to be exposed. That what the banks have done to people in this country who want an education.
Or want infrastructure. We're calling for a state bank like North Dakota has. They finance their infrastructure about half the cost we do because they don't have to bond through Wall Street, pay the interest to Wall Street, pay the fees and commissions. The interest comes back to the state. And we need a lot of infrastructure, even with more progressive taxation and more revenues that you begin putting into the infrastructure that's crumbled. I mean, look at the numbers we're talking about. $32 billion to fix NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, to remove the lead and mold and fix the elevators, roofs, and boilers. That they need a 5-year, $32 billion influx of money. The fast forward plan that Andy Byford just put forward to fix the MTA is $37 billion over 10 years. DiNapoli's estimate is $80 billion in additional revenues just to maintain roads, bridges, sewers, and water infrastructure upstate over the next 20 years. We're talking about a lot of money. And so we've got to, begin investing in those things. In a state bank, you can do the financing at less cost than going through Wall Street. So I think that can contribute to the whole question of how the banks, they get 40% of all profits now. And what they're doing, like with the Trump corporate tax windfall, they're not raising workers' wages, except for a few, anecdotal cases that got a lot of publicity, or hiring new workers. They're buying back their own stock to raise the stock price. They're doing mergers and acquisitions. They're giving themselves bonuses at the top level. That's another source of revenue. I mean, we're saying that if that windfall is not used to raise wages or hire new people, it should go back into the public treasury. The feds won't use it. We can use it to good use in New York.
Howie, if I could ask a question, I was wondering if you had a view one way or the other on whether Cynthia Nixon should remain as the nominee in the Working Families Party.
Well, I think from my point of view, if she was out, it'd be less competition for those progressive votes. So, and I think that's what they'll do. My sense is she doesn't want to be, quote unquote, the spoiler. I'm not worried about that because I think you waste your vote if you vote for what you don't want. And if you're a progressive, Cuomo is what you don't want. And, what we're hearing from the Working Families Party is the leaders want to get her off, but the rank and file doesn't like Cuomo, so they're having a debate. But that's for them to decide. I think we get into debate, and we got to go beyond Nixon, as I, enumerated some of the issues, and that's why we're in the race.
Fusion voting generally.
Well, the Greens have debates on this. I think it's a First Amendment issue. It's fine for people to form coalitions, but I would like to see our ballot reformed in New York State. Every other state with fusion, the candidate's on the ballot once, and then all the parties that endorse them is underneath. Here, you get another party, and you get 50,000 votes, so we have 8 ballot lines, but only 3 candidates created them. We created the Green Party, and Nixon and Astorino last time created 3 or 4 parties each. But those so-called parties are really instruments to give cross endorsements to major party candidates. And I think if we change the ballot, that would be less of a problem, and the ballot would be simpler. And I don't know if you want to get into ballot reform, but I have other ideas.
But I mean, one other thing about, fusion, the Working Families Party is a political club of the Democratic Party. If that's what they want to be, that's fine, but they should not be portrayed as an independent, progressive political party, but they're not. But also, when you have all these other parties that really aren't parties on the ballot, and you don't combine them into one line like they do in other states, it becomes very, very difficult for voters to find the true third-party candidates. Now, we're fortunate, and we're now up to the 4th because Howie's 5% vote total last time, so it's easy to find us on the ballot. But I used to tell people when they wanted to vote for the Green Party, go in and say a little, get down on your knees and say a little prayer before you vote, and then look up, because we're going to be somewhere down there in the bottom, and you can maybe try to find us that way. But it makes it very, very difficult for independents to sort of compete. And I helped get the Working Families Party ballot status back in, 1998, because they had declared that they had lost on election night, Danny Cantor and stuff. And, we, of course, had won that night with Al Lewis. And I called up the Working Families Party and I said, I know you're only reporting 42,000 votes, but I think you get 50,000 votes on the machine because you get 5 counties where they're counting 0 votes, which means they combine you and Valone in those 5 counties. That'll put you up to 45, 46, and there's probably 10% out there on the paper ballots. And people argue, well, why did you do that? They had already thrown in the towel. And I said, well, I'm a former head organizer for ACORN. Working Families Party is an ACORN operation now in New York, Communities for Change. And we said it's an experiment. We're following the, independent third-party progressive. They want to try this fusion thing like they tried with the new party. Let's give it a try and see it works, because both of us face a lot of problems in how you create a third party on the New York State election law. And I will say the Working Families Party has not succeeded with their strategy. They are very good at getting out the vote. We grant them that, but they get a lot of money from the Democrats to do that. And they keep on making more and more bad mistakes. I think people really have seen that in this year's cycle. And the fact that last time they say, well, the way to oppose Andrew Cuomo is to vote for Andrew Cuomo, but voting for him on the Working Families Party line. That's a very confusing message for a lot of people. And it's time for them to be willing to break free from the corporate control of the Democratic Party, or become a political action committee, as what they really are at this point.
Just as a second thing, Howie, you said that you guys are Plan B for Cynthia Nixon voters, because Nixon's still on the line. How are you Plan B?
Well, if she's still on the line and people, just want to go as far as she does, we're not. But I think when those voters hear what we're talking about, like, let's get home rule on rent regulation. Let's get a real climate action bill. Let's deal with all the problems with education. I think we're the better alternative, like I think we are for the self-described liberals who think Cuomo is their candidate.
Howie, you've been through this a couple of times now. As far as the debate goes, what history tells us is that there will be one debate and that everybody will be up on stage. I mean, can we expect anything different in 2018?
I think that's up to the media and civic organizations. I think they cannot let Andrew Cuomo dictate the terms. I think they should have a series of debates on different topics like I described, and work with the candidates to find dates where we can all be there, but not let, what has happened in the past. I would be told by, everybody from the ABC channel in Syracuse to the CBS channel in New York City, how would you come to a debate? I tell them yes. They say, okay, we're waiting to hear from Cuomo. And of course, then Cuomo sets the terms. And that's a disservice to the voters. So whether we have Cuomo dictating, one late debate, maybe when a football game's going on and, on the PBS station out of Buffalo like last time when not that many people will see it, or we have a series of debates where the media organizations get together and really give the voters what they ought to have. That's what I'm advocating, and I hope media organizations will, get a real backbone with Cuomo on this question.
And certainly a lot of upstate voters were upset about the primary debate in the Democratic Party, because they were like, this seemed to be just a New York City debate. Where are the issues, where are the concerns about the rest of the state? Howie has always done very well. I think Capital District, you've got, reading the Times Union, 13% in the last thing. She do very quite well in the Capital District. And in Syracuse, Ithaca area. So we also want to make sure that the upstate voters feel they have somebody representing them, while of course we want as high a percentage as possible in New York City. Thank you very much.